See, the first issue is how do you decide whether a particular program is a success in achieving something or the other. And I think his view is quite clearly that you can only do that through a randomized experiment. This is a pretty well-established point of view, and I think if you look at it purely technically, it's probably correct. J-PAL, I think, sort of embodies this approach. Now, mind you, so therefore, while I think it's technically correct, I wouldn't like to accept a proposition which says, if you can't do a randomized experiment, you have no idea whether something's working or not, right? So I don't think we should take this that far. But definitely, wherever you can do a randomized experiment, I think that's a good thing to do. You know, I've had discussions with Abhijit Banerjee on this. He's one of the leading lights in J-PAL. And, you know, he made very valid points to me, say on something like ICDS. I mean, ICDS is the oldest established nutrition program in the world. I mean, it started in 1975. Most people also think that we don't appear to have achieved what we want in terms of controlling undernutrition. Of course, a simple defense of ICDS is that, well, you know, it keeps evolving, so really these things take a lot of time, it's being changed, etc. Abhijit's view was very simple. He said, look, instead of rolling this thing out and universalizing it, which is what Karthik also referred to, that, you know, when you have something that becomes a moral imperative, it's very difficult to randomize it. So you can't sort of, you can't go into an area and say, well, I'm randomly going to have an ICDS here, and I'm not going to have an ICDS there, because it's, after all, an entitlement and so on. But, you know, having said that, there's always scope for randomizing in design. I mean, you could say, for example, that we are going to have ICDS everywhere, but we're going to randomize whether it's going to be done in this way or the other way. I mean, a very simple way of doing it is, you know, is it going to be done by cooking is all done by mothers, or cooking is all done by employees who are supervised by the school? Is it going to be run by just giving a mother's society money, or is it going to be run by physically providing all kinds of input? So even if one accepts the proposition that some things are universal and just morally and ethically, one can't be saying to someone, in order to find out whether ICDS works, we're going to deny it to you, because then we're going to check between who had it and who didn't have it. That's not going to work. So you do make it universal, but I think within that, there is actually a lot of scope for randomizing certain aspects. And I think that's a big debate, and I think we need to do more of it. So if you want evidence-based sort of policy, then I think on the whole I agree that we need to do it through the maximizing the extent of randomization that you can build into a system. And I think there's more scope for doing it than people think. So that's my first point. Now the second is really his description that, you know, when you want to do it, it's not easy. I mean, it's very complicated. You have to have a whole lot of involvement. And there, it's very, and he gives a lot of credit to the AP government, and I think that's a valid point, because this is not just something you tell someone that, okay, we agree. This is something that they have to get deeply involved in and to do. So it must have had a huge amount of leadership from within the AP government. No doubt Karthik and his friends in J-PAL must have persuaded them that it's worthwhile, so you can also take some credit for it. But I totally agree that that involvement and that ownership is absolutely essential for anything on this scale to actually happen. The numbers are indeed really quite huge. So that's the second part of it. Now, all this, by the way, is quite independent of the specific experiment, which is the use of an offline authentication system. There, I think he's produced a lot of results which entirely coincide with my priors. And I mean, it's generally a very good thing in policy making that when the results endorse what your prejudices are, you don't look at them too closely. You simply say, that's exactly right, it's good stuff, and so You know, and I think I'm not surprised by the results. I'm glad they're there. I didn't have a look at that paper, but you know, the eyeballing your tables, at some point you should explain to me, and maybe to others who may be as ignorant as I am, and there must be some, not all, but some. You know, in some of the tables, the adjusted R-squares are ludicrously low. Now, are those the tables where nothing is actually significant? Or is it that, you know, we are wrongly looking for very high? I mean, your values range quite a bit from 0.30 to 0.03. So I didn't get the paper until just now. I mean, that's one issue. I mean, which of these things, therefore, is truly significant and makes a difference? I mean, the numbers that you give, you know, X, so many minutes saved, so much, et cetera, they're quite impressive. But what are these very, very low R-squares about, I think is an interesting thing to look at. And you know, I mean, you make too much, in my view, of the distinction between this program and Aadhaar. I mean, clearly, in a narrowly defined sense, Aadhaar is an online authentication system, but it's authentication in pretty much the same sort of way. So while you're being very formally correct in saying this is not a test of Aadhaar, to my mind, it's a test of a system which Aadhaar would enable fully. Therefore, the conclusion that if this works, then it'll work with Aadhaar should be absolutely underscored. If you feel that that conclusion is incorrect and is wrongly taking credit, claiming credit for what Aadhaar would do, then you should make that clear. Because you were being very proper and saying, you know, haven't tested Aadhaar, etc. But you know, here again, as a proponent of Aadhaar, if your results had proven that it doesn't work, it would be very appropriate to say, well, you know, this is not a test of Aadhaar, etc. But since the results prove that it does work, unless you feel that Aadhaar can't do this, to my mind, those who doubt whether Aadhaar will have good results should be told quite categorically that, look, if you like these results, you shouldn't be opposing Aadhaar. Now, of course, I'm not going to comment on what the Supreme Court said. You have more flexibility in this matter. And, you know, in all these matters, whenever something is brought up constitutionally, etc., yes, you're right. The court hasn't actually said no. And I think, you know, this issue of whether you need a legal basis or not can be an open question. I mean, in my view, you do not need legal basis. It would be nice if you had a legal basis, but there are many things where the government says that, you know, if you want this benefit, I mean, if you want an employment, you need a degree. But that's not by law. I mean, you just regulate, you just say that, you know, if you want a particular kind of job, you need a particular degree. Well, I don't see why we can't do that in these benefits, but that's a matter which is before the court, and it'll take care of itself. I think that you seem to be feeling that the present system of the DBT not being integrated with the banks, I really wasn't very clear about that. I mean, it's quite clear that you need that integration. I think it's also quite clear that, you know, you need to incentivize the banks, and this whole issue of to what extent the banks need to sort of have that incentive in order to have this system being used more effectively is an open question. But you know, if a very large part of the benefits got transferred through the system, then frankly, the extent of incentive that you need is that much less. And remember, I mean, one of the reasons that you have public sector ownership of the banks is that not everything they do has to be, they have to be persuaded to do because of the bottom line. So many things we ask them to do as a matter of national, duty and so on. And I think this is not a bad one. The idea that DBT should be integrated with the banking side is absolutely central to government conception. And as a matter of fact, the DBT unit was originally set up as part of Aadhaar in the plan, linked to Aadhaar in the Planning Commission. But we actually recommended and supported, and the finance minister also, pushed, that, you know, if the DBT unit is going to work, then it really better be in the finance ministry, because getting the banks to take it on as a sort of a government decision is something that can only be mediated through the Department of Financial Services, which is why DBT was shifted out of the Planning Commission and into the, with our applause and support, etc. So it's not true that the financial inclusion agenda, insofar as the inclusion relates to the disbursements of benefits, is somehow being handled in a fragmented way. Now, of course, the RBI has a regulatory role, and that's not a role that should be eroded or diluted because of the concern about financial inclusion. So I think, frankly, they can carry on performing their regulatory role, and they've actually been quite good. I mean, for example, they have accepted that merely having an Aadhaar number is a sufficient know your client KYC requirement. I know that it may not be actually working in practice, but the present position is that if somebody has an Aadhaar number, then they should be able to open a no-frills bank account without having to get any introductions by anybody, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, people frequently tell me that, you know, depending on bank managers, this happens, doesn't happen. But this is not something that would be that difficult to actually roll out. Of course, part of the problem is that, you know, in the middle of an election year, making big changes is always difficult. I think, let's put it this way, the incentive to undermine the shift is a function of how successful the program is in stopping leakages. Now, if your belief is that the problem was simply unmitigated and uncontrolled imposition of hardship on people, but no leakages, then maybe, you know, one could say that the switch would not be so difficult, because it's a pure win-win situation and relatively easy to do. If, on the other hand, your perception is that the existing system facilitates massive leakage and you want it to be changed, one has to be exceptionally naive to believe that nobody will try to undermine the change. And I think we see that. I mean, you know, some of the data we've seen, for example, on things like LPG and kerosene in particular. I mean, the number of, once these things were introduced, the number of legitimate claimants for it dropped sharply. 30%, I think, in one of the districts in Andhra Pradesh. So I think this is important, and you know, how rapidly the DBT can be rolled out is something that will only be known in a post-election year. In an election year, it's bound to become controversial. I mean, many people have, for example, many people complained that the LPG linked to prepayments by Aadhaar cards. Many MPs, for example, would say to me that, you know, it's not working. And it's very clear that they didn't actually have an understanding of how the system worked. They've just been told by a whole lot of people that it's a mess. And so it's not surprising that, you know, it got temporarily suspended, etc. But I think that after the election is over, you have a clean run at making the change, and I think it'll be possible to do that. And of course, NREGA payments are a very, very major thing that we should switch to this basis. AP did it with a sort of offline card authentication. Aadhaar would enable it to do online. And the fact that Aadhaar is online, combined with banking being used as a sort of platform with KYC accounts, I mean, enables a huge amount of financial inclusion to actually take place. So I think this is a low-hanging fruit sort of waiting to be picked up in the course of the next 12 months. And I hope that, you know, whatever government is in power, that it actually proceeds to do this. Some of the concerns about privacy and all the rest of it, you know, while in a purely theoretical sense, philosophically, maybe you can never rule out privacy concerns in any interface between G to C. I mean, the only way you can be truly private is you have nothing to do with the government. Any interface with the government involves some loss of privacy. So I think this is being hugely exaggerated, and it has led to many well-meaning people sort of begin to have doubts. So I think hopefully, as we see some experiments of this kind working, those doubts will also fall.